everyone is doing well. Thank you again for joining us, especially to West Coast people or people in the time zones where it's currently morning right now. Huge props to you because I sure wouldn't be awake at 10 a.m. um, but welcome. Today we will discuss, you'll hear from professors and faculty members who are in the Women's Studies program, Women's and Gender Studies program. And I am very excited to learn more about this program. My name is Paula, by the way, and I am currently studying government, and I am a sophomore in the college. But enough about me. We'll get started with hearing more about the professors that we have here today. I am pleased to introduce Professor Velez. She is the academic director of the Community Scholars Program and a lecturer in the Women's Studies program. Some of her courses include feminist theory, which I'm pretty sure she is more than happy to talk about. And then we'll follow up with hearing about Professor Sandoza Raj. She is also an academic, she's the director of the academic programs of the Community Scholars Program. And she is also a professor in the writing department. So she'll talk more about how writing can intersect with the Women's and Gender Studies program. Please, Professor Velez, take us away and move forward as you please.
I will try to take you away. And I want to ask, but only if you feel comfortable, if people felt like turning cameras on. We had started this meeting saying that we wished we were in a classroom and that we could see one another. So if you feel comfortable, I would love to see your faces. So see how you feel about that. I'm assuming that you all are here because you're interested in women and gender studies. I should also, there's a little confusion between Alice and me. So Alice is the academic director of the Community Scholars Program. I was the academic director for like many, many years. So I am now teaching, but no longer the academic director. That is Alice. So everybody can hear me, and if there's anything you want to say in the chat, that would be great. And again, if you feel comfortable, I would love to see you. So I think I'll talk first about the work I do in the Women and Gender Studies program. I actually teach a few courses. That one is feminist theory, which I can talk more about in a minute. I teach a course called Reading Motherhood, which is cross-listed both for English, African American Studies, and Women and Gender Studies. And then I teach a cultural history of the 60s, and we certainly cover the radical feminist movement in that class. And then again, cross-listed for English, it's cross-listed for African American Studies, and it's cross-listed for Women and Gender Studies. Feminist theory is sort of a bedrock of the Women and Gender Studies program, which means it's a required class to major in Women and Gender Studies, and it's a required class for the minor. I'm not sure, could people maybe put in the chat if you feel like you're interested at all in majoring or minoring in Women and Gender Studies? I'd like to know that. I have many students who have a sort of double major in government and in Women and Gender Studies. It seems lately that is a real trend. But feminist theory I'm trying to think of a short description of the class. It's a class in which we look at history of women to some degree, but we're looking more at history of ideas about women. And we're looking at women's ideas about their own lives. We're looking at lived experience about women's lives. We're looking at something called theory in the flesh, which is, we're looking at theory, which is about ideas, but those ideas only come about by living in the world. So we look, theoretically, we look at ideas, let's say, about the ways in which women have been oppressed at various times, at various places over the years. So we might look at someone, an historical figure. It's interesting. One of our very first sort of examples of a theory about women is a theory of St. Augustine's. And he once said about women that women are necessary like the sewers under a palace. So to call that theory can sound kind of strange because it seems like just a terrible thing to say about women. On the other hand, it's ideas about women that certainly have influenced the lives of women, especially the daily lives of women. So we are looking at those. We're looking at past the media, past the discussion that you might read in the popular media about what are women's problems, because almost always those discussions are about what are middle class white women's problems. We read Bell Hooks, we read Angela Davis, but more than that, we have this belief, and I would say that both Bell Hooks and Angela Davis have really articulated this idea that instead of thinking, centering discussions about feminist theory around the white middle class woman, what if you begin take the margins and move them to the center? So what if you look, and I'll give you an example of that. You will hear in the media, you will hear on TV shows, you will hear in films, you will particularly hear from those who are nostalgic. And I'm talking about, well, I'm probably talking about the right wing for the 1950s, because everything was wonderful in the 1950s. And women, and think about that term, the way we even use that. What does that even mean? But they will tell you, if they know what it means, that women back then, they stayed home. They didn't go to work because that's what men did. And they'll act as if, they'll speak as if, they'll write as if this is a reality. You want to go back and look at the statistics, and they will tell you that at least 40% of all women were working in the 1950s, and about 70% of women of color. I have a friend, Lene Parker, who wrote a book about Black motherhood. And what she says is, I have 3 children and I work. My mother had 4 children and she worked. My grandmother had 3 children and she worked. And my great grandmother was a slave. This idea, and she was talking about the pressure in the culture, Lene was, to make her feel guilty, to make her feel torn. I should be at home with my children. Oh no, I'm not doing a good job at work. She said it never occurred to her that there's something Patricia Hill Collins calls mother work. And when you work and contribute to the economic support of your family as well as the emotional support, that's mother work. The job that you have is mother work. And she also talks about, and guess what? You don't have to be a woman with a biological child to do mother work. I have 2 sons. They're both married. One of them has 2 kids. The others have decided they don't want children. But my daughter-in-law, Megan, who people would say has no children, she's an aunt to my 2 grandchildren. She does mother work. Spent like 5 hours with them last Saturday drawing. And I can't do that. I'm not an artsy crafty person. So part of the big push of feminist theory is to understand all the assumptions that have gone behind the use of the word woman. The definition of woman, this sort of monolithic definition that the culture feeds us. And it is not based on the lived experience of women. It's based on pretty reactionary ideas about what a woman is. Part of feminist theory is postmodern theory. So that if we talk about my experience as a woman, then we need to take into account who I am, the economic circumstances that I lived in, the culture that I lived in, and never assume that my friend Lene, who wrote the book, have had some universal experience of motherhood, which is another thing the culture seems to be giving to us all the time. Um, so, maybe if you if you are interested, um, I'd be interested in knowing if you all identify as a feminist. And I might even go to one of my former students and Thais and ask, can I ask you that question? I mean, how do you identify as a feminist and how do you identify as a feminist?
Yeah, so I feel like typically in my generation, the word feminist is attached to like white feminism. And that's not necessarily the label that I would identify myself with, but I do consider myself a feminist that supports, um, Black, Indigenous, women of color all throughout, especially being one of myself. And the first things that comes to mind is like uh, the right of choice, and then like accessibility to reproductive health care, or uh, even like migrant feminism, like giving access to women who are on the trail to like menstrual products or like care for pregnancy. Or I think my attachment to feminism is more on that lane. So yeah, I would consider myself a feminist, but not in the way that like white feminism is introduced in the media. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that, it's interesting when you talk about choice. It's like I want choice to mean more than obviously the access to reproductive care is incredibly important. But reproductive care doesn't just mean abortion or contraception. It also means being able to have a child when you want a child. And I think that for women of color, that has been denied, certainly beginning, I mean, with slavery, where women were separated from their children. I teach Toni Morrison's Beloved, and that's a whole issue there. But it's sort of reproductive justice, and it means the whole range of things. And it does mean access to healthcare. It means access to menstrual products, and it means access to contraception. And those are things that I think that the sort of cultural majority just hasn't really supported. And I think it's really, really important. Um, and I also think, and I'm mentioning some of my favorite writers here, and one of them is Bell Hooks. And Bell Hooks does have this suggestion that, again, you have to identify what a woman is. And, I would say, like on the first day of class in feminist theory, that's the first question we take up. You know, what is that? And I would say that I use the word woman to mean a human being who identifies as a woman. And even that is complicated because a woman can certainly be someone who identifies in a different kind of way than a woman in the ways that we think of it. But we need to consider all that. Certainly, we need to consider the notion of transgender, but that's even a binary because there are many, many ways on a spectrum to identify. Um, I also do think, and I'll switch this a little bit. I'm going to go from bell hooks to another writer. Simone de Beauvoir, French writer, she wrote a book called The Second Sex. We read it in feminist theory. And, you know, one of the people that I think is so unsung is the playwright Lorraine Hansberry. I don't know if you know her work. She wrote A Raisin in the Sun when she was quite young, but she wrote an essay. I mean, she died unbelievably young in her early 30s, but she wrote an essay on the second sex, the Simone de Beauvoir French book. And the question that Simone de Beauvoir asked is, and I'm going to say that in some ways this is the central question, why are women the other? Why, across time, across culture, across place, women have been categorized as the other? And what I love about Lorraine Hansberry, and we're talking about in the 50s, so it's not like intersectionality. I know that Kimberly Crenshaw, we teach Kimberly Crenshaw, but it has been embedded in theory for a while. And Lorraine Hansberry in the 50s is taking up what de Beauvoir says and says, yes, women are the other. There are different kinds of others. And what Hansberry says is that perhaps there is a commonality, which certainly de Beauvoir is suggesting. And then what Bell Hooks says is we acknowledge our lived experience, we acknowledge that together, and that's where we're going to find some kind of commonality. And I don't mean to just, it looks like I'm talking quite a while, just like the time. I don't mean to be giving a lecture here, but I just wanted to talk about those general kinds of issues. And I'm happy, you know, first maybe we would stop. Do we have any questions? Peyton, I'm looking at you partly because I get to look at your beautiful face, but may I ask you, you're a prospective student, is that right?
Yes,
So where are you from?
I'm from Bowie, Maryland.
Okay. So how, yeah, Alice is from PG County. She's from Maryland. Yes, and I have one child who lives in Maryland as well. So, how would you, I don't want to put you on the spot, which I am, I know a little bit, but how would you describe yourself in terms of feminism, women and gender studies?
I think that I would describe myself as someone that's starting to look more into this topic because this is my first time. Like whenever I have the opportunity to go to women and gender studies, I often don't. But this is kind of my first time being in a talk about this.
Okay.
So I didn't I'm still trying to grasp the idea of what a feminist is. So I can't really say um obviously support women in everything that we do. Um, so I'm kind of just here to learn more and just absorb all that you have to say. So I don't really have a specific stance or anything, but
Well, what I love is that you have an interest. And I also think that question, what is a feminist, which you may be thinking is kind of a beginner question, it's not. It's a question that we ask at the beginning, the middle, and if, say, by any chance you were to graduate with a degree in women and gender studies, you would still ask that question. I have been teaching in this program for more than 30 years, and the answer to that question changes. So, one of the things, I'm not sure if we're still here, but I did see that we had a young man who was a participant, and I am going to shut up in a minute. But one year I taught an introduction to women and gender studies, not feminist theories, a long time ago. There were 30 students in the classroom, 15 identified as women and 15 identified as men. And that's pretty unusual, I have to say. And it was a semester where I think, Charlene, Erica was in that classroom. This is an alum that we're still very close to. And she dragged Caleb to that class. There were several women who dragged their boyfriends into that class. Damien Duen was in that class. And what it made me realize is that I know there are diversity requirements at Georgetown. I want there to be a gender requirement as well. That I want young men to engage in this conversation. I just will say really quickly, I have 2 sons, 2 grandsons, and a husband, and feel extremely often surrounded by boys, big ones, little ones, whatever. We talk about this from the time they're 3 years old. And I can say that both sons are feminists. My husband is a feminist. And, it's crucial that men begin to engage in this. So I'm going to be quiet, but can I introduce Alice? Okay. So I met Alice when she began teaching in the Community Scholars Program, which is a program for pretty much first generation college students who are coming to Georgetown. Their parents have not necessarily been to college. It is both an academic program and it is a resource guide program. Georgetown is bureaucracy, and part of our job is to help you navigate that. And I was for many years, I taught in, worked with the instructors, academic program, in the English component of women and gender studies. And I need to tell you, I'm old. I'm quite old. I've been there a long time. It was time for me to retire from that position. And really, we had one search and it just didn't work out. So the next year, but from the beginning, from the day I met Alice, who was in a little office down the hall from me, who was teaching in the writing program, I just knew, okay, this is the person. So Alice started teaching in the program. She is now the academic director. Charlene, I'm going to get that erased from my official bio. So Alice teaches the critical reading and writing seminar. She is teaching, she's a writer in her own right. She is an incredible essayist. She writes unbelievable and is published, obviously. She's teaching a literary nonfiction class, which is a whole other interesting category. But I do want to put her on the spot just a little bit as she's talking about this and just ask how this whole business with feminism informs your teaching life.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that lovely introduction. Elizabeth and I both fell in love with each other when we met. It's an ongoing love affair. It's interesting when you were talking about male students in your courses. I was reminded of my brother, who is now just a real staunch feminist, and he was just always the best big brother a girl could have. He was such a wonderful supporter. But he grew up in kind of a machismo culture in Langley Park, Maryland. There's a lot of traditional toxic masculinity in my neighborhood, in my school, and even in my family. And it's crazy to me that it wasn't until he took because of some sort of requirement during his when he was getting his bachelor's, he took a class on women's studies. And he said it took his breath away that even as someone who loved his little sister and always advocated for me and cared for me so deeply and supported me in everything I ever did and kind of raised me in a lot of ways, he said even having that close relationship with me did not prevent him from being, a kind of a jerk and really inhabiting a lot of ugly masculine traits. And it wasn't until he took a course in college and had to sit and think about the experiences of women and read about women for 3 months straight that he actually had a kind of revelation and realized, I've got a lot of work to do and I am a feminist. And now, he's older than me. He's almost 50 years old now, and he's just a lifelong feminist. But it didn't start with having a loving relationship with a sister or his mother, our mother. It started with actually doing the work of being in a class and unpacking and unraveling all of these things that he had been taught and didn't even realize he had been taught. So I just want to co-sign that I I really think male students, male identified students should be taking these courses as much as women identified students. So
Yes.
that's my plug there. In terms of my own work, so I do teach creative nonfiction, even though that's not my doctoral work. It's the one of the courses I teach here at Georgetown. And what's interesting about nonfiction is that for a very long time, the autobiography and nonfiction was kind of the ghetto of writing, I should say. The fiction and poetry were considered the genres that were really important and that were where real artists, resided, and that autobiography and nonfiction was reserved for women and for people of color. So you often have a lot of writing by Black writers, by writers of color, and by women. At the time, it was considered ghettoized to say that, well, Black people can't write fiction, women can't write poetry, but they can do this autobiography thing because that's easy. That's just writing about your own experience. I mean, it's interesting to see how the genre has evolved, where now nonfiction writing kind of is an element across all genres. You'll see autobiographical writing appear in STEM research, in all kinds of scholarly fields. Just the introduction of the author as a presence in the writing that is part of the research, part of the reporting, as opposed to being separated from it. So it's really interesting to think about the evolution of nonfiction as a place where people of color, marginalized writers were allowed to express themselves and were seen somewhat kind of separated off, and how that's evolved now to where everybody wants to write nonfiction, everybody wants to write their memoir, everybody wants to write, for their blog. So that is my little my take on creative nonfiction. In terms of my own writing, I tended for a long time to focus way more on my race and ethnicity than on my gender. I was a very late bloomer as a feminist. And I think that's part and parcel with a lot of women of color, that we, for whatever, no, I won't say for whatever reason, we are at times forced to think about our racial identity and our ethnic identity and even our class identity before our identity as women, that we are, and that's part of just my experience, right? I'm seen as a person of color, I think, even before, or in some ways secondary to the fact that I'm a woman. That is just not as an important identity, both in terms of how I am perceived, but also in terms of how I move through the world. Just in relationship to what you said, Elizabeth, about white feminism, that my experience of being a woman is very different than what has long been the standard experience of women, which is a white middle class woman experience, which is just not what I had. I grew up working class, very poor, very brown. So I think that my thinking about my experiences as a woman follows that trajectory, that for much of the initial things that I wrote about, thought about, both in my research, my doctoral research, my early publications. In fact, even the way I talked about myself, I called myself Ace and Dosaraj because I didn't want to be seen as a woman writer. I wanted to be seen as someone that was not focusing so much on my gender. I wanted you to be, you see my name, you're like, hey, is that a woman? Is that a man? Who knows? And that much of my writing didn't even address my identity as a woman, or if it did, it would be in a brief aside. In those initial publications, I was talking very much about race and class, and I would mention my gender identity in passing, or as a way to qualify my experience, or to somehow set myself apart from what I was talking about, which for me was still a very male-centered, man-centered understanding of the world. And only I shouldn't say now, only in the past maybe I'm 44 years old, so only in the past maybe 5 to 6 years have I started writing about what it is to be a woman, a brown skinned woman, moving through the world with expectations on my appearance, expectations on what I'm going to talk about, the role I'm going to play. So yeah, it's been an ongoing journey. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is that as young people, and I think back to myself, I always tell this to my students, you'll be surprised how much you evolve in your thinking over time. And the person I was, I say this, I'm sure Paul has heard me say this, the person I was when I was 18 would be unrecognizable to me now. I'm such a different person. And it's not that that 18-year-old was wrong in any way, but that my ideas have just continued to evolve, that as I'm reading, learning more, I'm just adding, I'm shedding, right? I'm letting go of ideas that no longer fit me, or I'm reshaping them, refiguring them, I'm adding on, I'm taking off. And that I think is part of what's great about being in college and taking courses like women's studies courses, where don't necessarily have to be in the major, you don't have to pursue it for at any length, but you can really allow yourself to be surprised in some of these classes, just like my brother was. I don't think he was expecting to become a feminist. I think he was probably rolling his eyes for the first week or two of class before he really started to think about these issues. Oh, thank you, Paula. That's so sweet. Yeah, so that's my take. I want to make sure that we allow folks to ask any questions they might have about the programs that we have at Georgetown, but also just maybe the experience of being a woman on campus. What's that like in a place like Georgetown that is not necessarily very male, but certainly very white and male identified, I would say, in a lot of ways.
So we would love to answer your questions.
I mean, I would even actually throw it out to you all. What is it like being a woman identified student in this pandemic, in this current moment with all of the protests happening, all of the cultural change that's happening right now? I'm curious what it's like walking through, I guess, metaphorical hallways, since you're not actually walking through school hallways right now.
I kind of wanted to ask like a different question, just because I've never really been around an environment where like feminism and like fighting for like the rights of women has been treated as something important. I feel like whenever I talk about it, especially like in my community, people tend to just roll their eyes, or they tend to say it's not a problem, just because I feel most of my community, we're all like it's like an Hispanic culture, and it's also like a low income neighborhood, so people just tend to not really care about it. So as I mentioned, like it's very frustrating. So I don't really know how it feels like to be around a supportive group of like women who want to like learn more about it. So I just wanted to ask, like, how is that environment?
And I mean, we have 2 students here who have experienced that. And again, might be putting ice on. I mean, you were in my class. We certainly talk about a lot of issues that have to do within Hispanic culture as well. And we have writers who write so much about seeing their mothers not given the opportunities as women that they want for themselves, but also that it's a struggle. When you have you're struggling with something you believe and you're not supported a lot by your own culture, it's really difficult. I mean, I see that struggle a lot. Dice, you?
Yeah, honestly, the biggest way that machismo has affected me personally, um, which is insane when I think about it, but it's the fact that I can't drive. And you think that's like, what? You don't have a driver's license? But my father, he had this like, I don't know where this was rooted, but he believed that women couldn't drive, which meant that if I wanted my license, I would have to wait till I was 18 to like figure that out on my own. But by the time I came to Georgetown, I was 17. So I left my home before I could even turn 18. And I've been like, I've been living here ever since then. And he was also a big reason why my mom couldn't get a driver's license. And eventually she did, but it was behind his back. So it's like even my own mother had to navigate those such a basic necessity, such a basic skill that you need. And to this day, I don't have a driver's license. And I'm hoping that, once I graduate, I'm able to find a source to like let me figure that out. But that's not something that I have the support with my dad. So thank you. thank you for the encouragement. And obviously, because it's DC and it's a city, it hasn't been that much of a problem. But, there's moments where it's like my life would have been a million times easier if I just had a driver's license or a car or someone to teach me to devote the time to like, give me the opportunity to learn how to drive. And this isn't something that's like super uncommon. Like I live with two other women, both of them women of color, both of them in the Hoya Saxa community, and they both don't have their driver's license. Obviously they have different circumstances, but there's like even, you know, we're all above 21 and this is something that's still affecting us. So that's been my personal dealt with machismo, but there's so much that goes into it. Like sometimes when I go back home, like on visits or whatever, I sometimes forget how like isolated I am here with my feminist friends, because here we're always talking about it and how like that affected us back home and like things like just like we're always talking about it, but then I go back home and no one's having these conversations, and I get like a little bit like not starstruck. I get like almost like put back in my place, because the person I was when I was 17 was completely different from the person I am today. And sometimes when I go back, like I think I put myself back in those shoes, and it's like it's constantly like a battle trying to like, no, like I'm better than this and I've grown back to this, and there's things that I've like had to unlearn. That's the biggest thing about college. Like you think you come to college to learn, and you will, but honestly, a big part of it is unlearning everything you've been taught growing up, and then like deciding what are the things you want to keep and what are the things you want to like filter out. And machismo can be one of them. Internalized feminism can be one of them. You know, internalized homophobia, racism. I'm sorry. So, but yeah. So I don't know. There's so much unlearning that needs and unpacking that needs to happen when you go to college. It's really just about having like an open mind and willing to like come in with a blank slate and willing to like learn from your past, but also like grow from it. I hope I answered your question.
Beautifully, beautifully.
Yeah.
I mean, really important things. Thank you. And I want to make sure that everybody saw Alice's. Would you mind reading that chat, Alice? Because it's really important about men.
Yeah, I think that's a real big issue that Black feminism tackles, which is that for a lot of men, especially Black men, men of color who are victims of racism, who are struggling against just real oppressive forces that are taking away their humanity, it can be very difficult for those folks to also see that they have or are part of an oppressive power structure, the patriarchy, right? So for someone like my brother, who's like, I'm a brown man, I have a lot of disadvantages, he was at the time, a poor Black man, a poor brown man. It was very difficult for him to think of himself as somehow having any power to oppress anyone else or to be guilty of anything like that. So I think that's part, again, why I think male identified students should be taking these courses as well, because it's all about intersectionality, not just in terms of being oppressed, but intersectionality in terms of power. And that operates for women as well, right? So, you can be a white woman who is affected by sexism, who also is benefiting from racism, and that all of us need to be thinking about those things, whether you're benefiting from a class status or you're benefiting from able-bodiedness, you're benefiting from being cisgender or straight or beautiful by traditional standards, whatever those things are. There's all kinds of places where we can be both victims of a power structure, but also benefit of both oppression and power.
You froze for just a second, Alice, but I think.
Oh no.
Just a second.
I'm sorry. I hope you got some of what I had to say.
Well, I would just echo that looking at systems of oppression, the ways that which we benefit is absolutely crucial. And it isn't just seeing it, it's then figuring out ways in which to do something about it, to be a different person in the world. Yeah, it's complicated, I think.
Can I also add on to that with my experience in Georgetown classes? I took a class called Women in American Politics, and then I took another class, Women in Leadership. I'm taking that class right now, and I remember both of those classes, even though they were pretty big classes, they were full of women. And then only about there was always 2 or 3 women of color, including me. And on that first class, I didn't think about it too much. I just went with emotions and, concluded the class. But in the second class, the women in leadership, I started asking myself more like, wow, this class is filled with women, even though it's like an important topic that should involve women, men, non-binary folks, everybody. It shouldn't just be women in these discussions, because we're having like super important discussions about like, what does it take to be a female leader in the workplace, basically.
Right.
And I remember I brought up that question in one of the discussions, because we were talking about like diverse team members, like how do you create a diverse team? And I was like, well, it's really interesting that like 95% of the women here are white, and there's only like 2 or 3 women of color, and then there's no men. And I was like, we think of diversity in a certain way, and I was like, it can also mean like having people who are normally labeled under like the oppressor or whatever. So and I remember when I brought that up, when I said men, they treated it like a dirty word. They're like, men, like don't even bring that up. Like, I was like, we're here because we're arguing against everything they've done to us at the workplace. And I'm like, I get that, but it's like, we need to have them in this discussion. Obviously, like Georgetown men are different from like the bosses and the CEOs that were like critiquing, So we're like, they're gonna be the future whatevers, like future leaders of the workplace. So they need to be involved in these discussions too. And the fact that it's not even a requirement that they take courses like those. And those 2 courses weren't necessarily like women and gender studies courses. They were like international affairs courses. They were like outside of that. So it's like, even so, like they're not labeled under women's and gender studies, but men are still not taking them. So
I wonder if like I wonder if that can be solved by just renaming courses, because I often have that issue with I taught a course on the Black autobiography last year, and I really thought hard about whether I wanted to include the word. Well, I wanted the course was cross-listed in AFAM, and I wanted Black students to know about the course, but I also was worried that we often just we are drawn to our identities, and we're often we shut out other identities. We go, oh well, Black autobiography, those are for Black students, that's not going to be a course that I'm interested in. And I was really thrilled to see white students in that class, not as many as I wanted maybe, but I did see a few. But I wonder how to get around that problem. And I wonder if it's a matter of just renaming courses so that they're more open-ended. And then when you get into the class, you realize, oh, this actually is going to be a class where we're just going to be reading autobiographies by Black writers. And that's okay. Like, that's going to be interesting and valuable to all of us. Just even us, in that course, we only read American writers. And as an American, as most of us or many of us in these classes are, it's valuable study to do, even if you don't belong to that particular racial identity. So yeah, I think about that a lot in terms of wanting sometimes the very students that need to take the courses aren't going to take the courses because they look at that title and they go, oh, that's not for me. I'm not a woman. I'm not a Black person. I'm not a queer person. So I don't need to take that course. That's not for me.
It's really interesting, and I'll just say this very briefly, that maybe 20 years ago, women's studies at Georgetown was just women's studies. There was a 2-year discussion about adding the word gender, and I mean 2 years. And there were plenty of feminists, myself included, who came of age in the 60s, and we saw this idea of this is for women. There were separatist women communities that, right, I love what you said, things about talking about we need men, and all these women saying, what? We don't. But of course you're right. But that discussion, Alice, about naming, putting the word gender, which meant, yes, we're talking about gender issues. Not all of them will be identified as women. Took 2 years. It was the right thing to do. There were some older women that I knew who threatened to resign over the name change, because it felt like, let's say that you were teaching Black autobiography, but you called it autobiographies of race. Well, people would say, wait, what? And to put that word gender in there instead of women felt like a betrayal to some women. And I'm going to predict what's going to happen next. We're going to take that word women out, and it's going to be gender studies, as it is at a lot of universities. And, part of me feels like, yeah, something will be lost, but a lot will be gained. And as professors, we have a lot of leeway to call our classes what we want and then to teach them in, ways that, as you might say, aren't particularly, you don't have to expect the way in which the class will be taught. All right, that's it for me. I'm not saying anything else.
Does anyone have any more pressing issues? This was a wonderful conversation. And honestly, even as a government major, I've had the opportunity to take women's and gender studies related courses, including one of my favorites was gender and sexualities, an intro to gender and sexualities course. And honestly, I can always go on forever talking about all these issues, like something that I'm very passionate about. And I hope you future Hoyas are too. So with that being said, anyone else have anything they want to say or ask before we head out? Okay, I'll take that as a no. But in that case, Professor Velez, Professor Sandosaraj, I'm sure you don't mind like dropping in like your emails or like contact information, if that's okay with you
Gotcha.
both.
Okay.
Thank you. And before we hop out, I just want to reiterate what Obella said. So we will go back to the main Zoom meeting. Thais, if you don't mind dropping down the link in the chat in case some of you don't have the link at hand. And also, please fill out the evaluation survey. I have dropped it in the chat right now. It really means a lot to us that we get this survey filled out. It only takes like 2 minutes of your time. So please, I would really appreciate that. Other than that, Thais, Professor Velez, Professor Sandosaraj, do you have anything else to say?
Just thank you for being here, and I hope that we get to see you on campus next year. And it was great having the opportunity. And by the way, congratulations for coming to Georgetown. If that's your decision, we would like to see you here.
Yeah, I'll just echo Professor Velez. Wonderful to have you here. If you have any questions for me at all, please do take advantage of my email address. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and would just love to see you on the hilltop next year. Hoya Saxa.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and I apologize, Charlene. I completely forgot you hopped back in the Zoom. Do you have anything else to say?
I said Paula, Thais, amazing. Peyton, Laura, I hope you see the caliber of students, this intellectual prowess in this community with both Professor Velez and Professor Sandosaraj. So fantastic.
Yeah, Thais and Paula, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to see you.
Thank you.
Alice, we'll talk.
Yes, see you soon. Bye.
Okay.
All right. Bye. Future Hoyas will see you in the main room. Bye.
Bye.